Welcome back to Seed School, or welcome for the first time if you didn't attend last week. If not, no worries. We can catch you up very quickly. This week, we are jumping right in. We've gotten through our terminology, and we are going to talk about the Fabaceae family and the Asteraceae family, Asteraceae family, two of those. So just a little word to remind everybody, when we're talking about seed saving here, for those of you especially who were not last week, we're always talking about open pollinated varieties. So if you're going to start with seeds to save, make sure they are not F1 hybrids. Make sure they do not carry any type of intellectual property restrictions of which you are aware, so that you can be sure that you have true seed. So this week's a nice foray into seed saving because the Fabaceae family generally are among the easiest seeds to save. It really is as simple as growing them and drying them down and harvesting them, and we'll go through that in detail and give you a few notes about each one. And then with the Asteraceae family, we're going to focus on two crops in particular. That is lettuce and the chicories. There are two different species of chicories that we're going to talk about. So we're going to focus on, within the Fabaceae family, basically four types of seeds to save. They're more or less indistinct from a seed-saving perspective, but there are a few little notes to consider as we're talking about in terms of the continuum of self-pollination and outcrossing, like we discussed last time. So we have the common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris, peas, which include snow peas, snap peas, shell peas, soup peas, all Pisum sativum. The fava bean, also known as a broad bean. And then the southern pea and the yard-long bean. Southern peas, also known as cow peas, African peas, Crowder peas sometimes, and black-eyed peas. Both those and the yard-long bean that many grow for fresh bean are all the same genus and species. So we're going to treat these pretty much as indistinct from one another from a seed-saving perspective. But there are some nuances to saving seed and to growing them side by side. So with all of these in the Fabaceae family, the life cycle is annual. We grow them from seed to seed in one season. The seed type is a dry seed, so we're letting the seed pods themselves dry down as opposed to the wet seeds that we discussed last week, like tomatoes or cucumbers. The flower type, without going into too much detail, is what's known as a perfect flower that's also self-compatible. So basically, for our knowledge, the bean flower, has everything it needs to pollinate itself. Down here, we have self-pollinating with varying degrees of outcrossing, meaning all peas and beans in the Fabaceae family are self-pollinating. Some have a flower structure that is such that the anther pollen is already shed onto the stigma and gone down the tube into the ovary before the flower even fully opens. So they are much stronger in terms of self-pollinating because the other plants around don't really have much of a chance to get their pollen over there. However, for those of you who have biodiverse farms and gardens, we have lots of bumblebees. And bumblebees, among others, are fabulous at breaking into pea and bean flowers. So just because these are self-pollinators and just because they're strong self-pollinators does not mean that they are not capable of crossing. Just as a general rule, most peas, you experience very little outcrossing. So peas are a safer one if you're growing, let's say, snow peas and snap peas in proximity to one another. It's safer to assume that those will not cross with one another. Beans, it can differ based on what varieties you're growing. Some old-timers will tell you that you can grow 3 different species of beans side by side and they'll never cross with one another. And that's there's some anecdotal truth to that, depending on the varieties of beans you're growing. Others have more of a tendency to cross with one another, aided by pollinators of all types. Fava bean is a notable exception to these. It also is a strong self-pollinator, meaning you can have one fava plant and you can save one bean pod off one plant and still have viable seed. But favas are much more promiscuous than a lot of their other Fabaceae counterparts. So there's a lot higher of a chance of favas outcrossing with other favas. So any of you who are daring to grow 2 or 3 or 4 species of favas side by side, wanting to keep them pure, want to keep in mind that favas have a strong tendency to outcross when they're near their peers, even though they can produce viable seed with their own mechanisms. So we learned that the hard way, anecdotally speaking, because we took out a lot of accessions from the USDA gene bank, and I had the grand idea in my early days to just grow them all side by side because they're self-pollinating, right? And then whoever's left will be the ones that we save and preserve. What could go wrong? They crossed right up. So we didn't even know what we had after the second and third year because the varieties we took out were already so crossed up. They grew right next to each other. It was a big wide patch. We had tons of bumblebees and supporting habitat. So grow one variety of fava unless you can isolate them by 200 feet or more. And even then, it's no surefire thing. But that being said, some crossing is not bad. I mean, if you're growing, let's say, Windsor and Vroma, two varieties of green favas, and you're doing selection work, meaning you're selecting the best plants, if a little cross-pollination happens, you still have, essentially, a green fava bean. You may have variations, you may have undesirable traits that might have been inherited, but generally speaking, if you're saving the best of the best over time and time again, there's no huge disruption. You're growing two things that are pretty similar in terms of their varietal specific side by side, because you're not going to deviate too much from what you want to get. Another thing worth noting, which is something we discovered more recently, is that the scarlet runner bean, which is a different species than the common bean, is also a very promiscuous bean. And it not only crosses with other scarlet runner beans nearby, but it can cross species into the common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris. So all this is just to let you know when you're designing what you want to save and how, where you want to put things, and making decisions about what populations you want to put and what you don't. That being said, there's little concern if you do have cross-pollination happen, because peas and beans generally are very easy to clean up, so to speak, meaning if you do have one variety of bean crossed with another, a lot of times you might even see it in the first year as you harvest those fresh pods. If not, you'll definitely see it in subsequent years. It's easy enough because they tend to be self-pollinating so strongly to weed those out and clean up your bean species. So don't worry if you make mistakes. It's all about making mistakes. So here's just some information for growing considerations. We recommend about a 20-foot isolation distance for common beans and for peas as well, those that tend much more towards reliable self-pollination. When we put more for others, that's pretty much talking about the fava bean. You want to have at least 75 to 100 feet isolation distance for fava beans, and even that in itself is not a guarantee. Bees can travel miraculous distances, so these are all approximations. But basically, if you're thinking about growing multiple species of, or multiple varieties of the same species, just take into consideration that where you grow will affect how easy it is for them to cross-pollinate. But generally, we've had common beans isolated by a distance of 20 feet, and we've seen little to no outcrossing there, even with high biodiversity on our farms. Here, as with all the other crops that we're going to talk about in seed school, the population size we break into essentially two categories. So one is how many do you need in terms of plants for viable seed, and then how much do you want for genetic maintenance. You may find yourself somewhere in between these two numbers. Genetic maintenance is basically the maximum recommendation for long-term varietal maintenance, because when you're thinking about maintaining something not just in your garden over a few years, but something that can be handed down for generations and generations, you want the highest amount of inherent genetic diversity within that population as you possibly can, so it can continue to adapt and co-evolve. So genetic maintenance for long-term considerations is different than you trying out saving seed for 1 year or you saving a seed for 5 or 10 years with a small population. So to that point, if you have one bean plant in your garden and you save seeds from that one bean plant, you will have viable seed. And that seed will continue to be pretty strong for a number of years, depending on the variety itself and its own inherent diversity. But if you're thinking about keeping a variety for the entirety of your lifespan or for generations to come or to share widely, the more the merrier is generally the rule of thumb. However many plants you can have in your garden is however many plants you want to have to save seed and exchange pollen with one another. So very straightforward with all the Fabaceae when it comes to harvesting. You basically let whatever you don't harvest dry down and turn tan or brown. And when the seed pod is crispy to the touch, kind of crunchy, you know that the seeds inside are ready. That being said, there are all sorts of problems and issues and predations that can happen. So if you have something that's particularly precious that you want to save seed from and you don't have any pods that are perfectly tan and crispy by the end of the season, it's not the end of the world to pull some green pods and take a risk anyway. There is a certain point at which the pods are really, really swollen. They look like they're full of peas or beans, but they're still kind of green. In most cases, if you take those off to ripen off the vine, especially if you bring part of the vine with it and allow it to ripen on that part of the vine, you can still potentially get viable seed. So if it's a really terrible season or you plant really late and you feel like, oh, I missed the window, nothing's turning brown, in that circumstance, don't despair and at least try to pull something green in and bring it inside and see how it does. There's a huge difference, especially with larger seeded crops like the Fabaceae family, in terms of when you harvest. So even though something's dried down on a plant, if it's a really humid day or it's just after a rainfall or there's just a lot of ambient moisture, you're going to find that those pods are going to bring that moisture inside and you're going to have to work that much harder at drying them down. It also may not feel crispy to the touch even though it's dried down. So in a perfect world, everything's going right with your garden or your farm and the crop has grown beautifully. It's the end of the season. Just wait till they're dry and crispy. Take them off. You can either, one of two things, harvest the individual pods as needed, or you can pull the whole plant in at the end of the year. There's a little note down here about trimming at the ground level because based on our experience, we found it's a lot easier if you decide because of the scale that you're growing at or because of timing or whatever other, there's a rain coming, you want to just pull all the plants in and not take the time to pull each individual pod out. Trimming it at ground level avoids bringing all that soil in, which is that much easier to clean later. So instead of ripping the entire plant out of the ground, roots and all, and bringing soil aggregates and rocks and things like that in, just cut it at the base level. So for processing, it's always better, even if you've brought something in to dry down fully, to process when it's a dry day. This is across the board. The weather matters a lot. Even if you've done your due diligence and you've dried things down and you've stored them appropriately, as soon as you bring them out into an area with ambient moisture, they're going to re-moisturize. They're going to continue to imbue moisture because that's what seeds love to do. So when you clean them, it is a substantial difference between a dry day and a humid day in terms of how easily your seeds clean. So for all the Fabaceae, there are a few ways you can go about it. If you're harvesting small lots, especially if you have friends and family who are willing to participate, you can bring those pods inside, you can sit by a fire, tell stories, and shell them one at a time. This is beautiful if you have a group especially, or if it's by, yourself by a fire on a dreamy winter night. And these are also the cleanest ways to process the beans, where you don't have as much chaff, you don't have leaf material, pieces of stem. You can get really clean beans by pulling them open, shelling them, throwing the pods away. If you've harvested a lot in a bigger format, you've pulled entire plants, or you've cut parts of the plant to dry, you can do a number of things. You can stomp on them with a tarp, but we have an insulation buffer listed here because just folding a tarp in half generally without either a lot of chaff with the bean plants themselves or without an extra insulating layer can actually step on the beans themselves and create splits and break the beans. So you want to be mindful when you're stepping on things or if you're threshing them with a stick that as you're doing this, you want to make sure there's enough of an insulation buffer with the tarp and the rest of the chaff in there, or with two tarps or a little blanket, just to make sure you're not splitting beans and peas. So if you have insect pressure on your peas or beans, this is most evident that when you're shelling a few beans or peas, you can see a little hit mark on the seeds themselves. Sometimes you can even see a worm wiggling out, or you see some insects inhabiting the pod. If you have any concerns about insects or larvae at all, beans and peas freeze really well. And so put them in a bag, airtight, put them in a freezer for about 3 days, and you've effectively killed any of the insect pests that might be in there. There's nothing worse than feeling like you've brought this in, you've made it to the finish line, you've put them in storage, and then you open that jar up next season, and it smells like a moldy mess, and there are all these maggot corpses inside. It's incredibly discouraging, and you can avoid that just with a couple days of freezing. One thing to keep in mind that we'll reiterate time and time again, if you put anything in the freezer, when you take a bag out of the freezer, what happens? Condensation happens. There's some educated people in this audience who have taken this course before. Condensation sticks to the bag when you pull it out of a freezer. That is, as soon as you open up a bag, with all that condensation going to creep right onto your seeds. So when you take something out of a freezer, always let it get to room temperature before you open it. Simple rule of thumb. And then like we talked about last week, we generally use a shatter test to test for dryness. And that means with a bean or a pea, something larger that you can't split with your fingers, hit it with a hammer or a stick. If it shatters in half or breaks into pieces, then it's dry enough to be put into storage. If it has a dent in it or kind of bends instead of breaks, it's not dry enough yet. Simple rule of thumb. If you're ever unsure and you still need to store them, put them in paper. Put them in an envelope, put them in a paper bag. That way they can still breathe in any residual moisture that might be in there, has the time to breathe out, and store them in a cool, dry place. Easy enough. We're going to spend a little more time in this class talking about the Asteraceae family because it's a nice way to introduce some nuances, both with annuals and biennials, and with different ways of saving and processing seed. So lettuce is where we're going to start. It's another, very relatively speaking, easy crop to start with. Meaning, if you have a very small garden and you have one lettuce plant that you love and you save seed from that one lettuce, lettuce tends very, very, very strongly towards self-pollination and self-fertility. It can cross, and it may cross, especially if you have lots of micro-wasps and small pollinators helping to do the trick. But lettuce is a very easy one in terms of ensuring that your variety will grow true to type versus other species that may be, or crops that may be more promiscuous. The challenge with lettuce, as we'll get into, is really on the actual seed end of things when you're harvesting the seed. Everything else is very straightforward. So lettuce also is an annual. When you're thinking about growing lettuce from seed, you want to start as early in the season as possible because that does a number of things. One, it's a really excellent opportunity to select for bolting tolerance or bolting resistance, meaning when a lettuce converts its energy from vegetal growth to flowering growth, it goes up, and that's undesirable for us in the gardens, but we want that we can get seed. If we're planting lettuce later in the summer or the fall especially, we are not getting to the window where the lettuce plant can bolt, flower, and mature viable seed in time for the frost. So if you have dreams of saving lettuce seed, it's ideal to save from the earliest populations of your spring lettuce as possible. And then you also have a de facto way of selecting for bolt resistance if you're picking the lettuce plants that are the slowest to bolt in your patch. So it's an annual. The seed type is dry. Again, we're harvesting dry seed right off the plant. We're not fermenting. The flower type is a perfect flower. It's self-compatible, and it's self-pollinating. So the flower has everything it needs. And the thing that we call a lettuce flower is actually a composite of many little flowers. So what looks like one little Fabaceae lettuce flower, when you see that maturing, you look down and there can be 10 to 25 seeds just from that one flower. It's actually an inflorescence of many little flowers put together. Which means that one lettuce plant, if it's grown well and makes it to maturity, can produce like 1,000 lettuce seeds, more than you'd ever need, even if you're just sowing for salad greens. So it's a really good crop for that reason to save seeds from. Here you see lettuce that's been potted up. So we dug up about, I think in this case, 35 or so of our favorite lettuce plants from a patch that had a lot more variation. And we pulled those out and we let those all flower in a cluster together so that they weren't cross-pollinating with their neighbors. So isolation distance is a little tighter here, but again, if you have a high pollinating population or you're concerned about varietal purity, give it a little more space. Same as the Fabaceae family, one for viable seed. You only need one lettuce plant, you'll still get great lettuce seed and you'll have more than you can handle. But if you want to keep genetic maintenance on a plant, the more the merrier. So we recommend at least 25 for that. So harvesting lettuce is a little nuanced. Lettuce is at its mature seed stage when the pappus, the little kind of feathery tufts on the lettuce flowers, are evident and coming out, and they're turning white. When that seed is fully mature, the reason that it has this white pappus seed, for those of you especially who know native wildflowers, is because lettuce wants to be dispersed by the wind. And so as soon as that lettuce pappus is fully mature, it's going to get caught up in the first breeze possible. So it's really crucial to pay attention to that pappus stage. You'll see as the flower dies off, here's the little ovary that's starting to mature the seeds, and the pappus is just emerging like a little kind of Seussian truffle tree. And then that pappus gets wider and wider and opens up more into sort of a pom-pom shape. And by the time that's fully open, it's almost too late. So we have recommendations down here. There's a number of ways to handle that. If you're on a garden scale, or even if you're on a farm scale and you have the time or labor to do it, the most surefire way is to visit that patch every 2 or 3 days once things start becoming mature and harvesting by hand. So you're going up to those pappuses that are wide up enough that they're not fully open, but you can see these little filaments coming down attached to the seed. And you can just pinch that little pappus up and rub it in your hand a little bit, and you have lettuce seed drop right into your bucket or your envelope or anything else. And so if you're visiting that patch for over the period of say 3 to 4 weeks, you can harvest to order every flower that's ripe, because the lettuce will be sort of indeterminate in its flowering nature. It's not all ready at once. Flower here, flower there, flower here, flower there. So that's the most surefire way and also the cleanest way to harvest lettuce seed. Just go out there from time to time, pick off what you see is most ripe, drop it in, the pappus falls off easily, no big deal. Another way of approaching it is when about a third of your lettuce patch or your lettuce plant is mature. This applies really more towards people saving lettuce on a larger scale, because if you're watching one plant, you can easily just pick a few things off. You don't need to take this method per se, but if you have a number of lettuce plants you're saving seed from, when about a third of the patch is showing maturity, that means about a third of the flowers on each plant, relatively speaking, are mature. You can start walking out there every couple days with either a tub or a bag, and you can just lean those flowers over and tap them a little bit, and the most mature seed on a non-windy day will fall right into your bucket or your bag. It's another easy way of doing it without investing the time in pinching every little last seed. So it depends on how precious the lettuce seed is to you, how much you want to capture for future years. But it's easy enough to just go out there with a big vessel when things are about a third mature and just tap the plants as needed, and do that every couple days, and you'll have plenty of seed that way. Another way, which is mostly what's utilized by commercial growers, is to wait till about 2/3 of the seed is ripe. By that time, the stuff that's mature is really mature and wants to fall right off. But there's still stuff that's coming up behind it that's not necessarily mature enough that you can pull the pappus off easily, but is mature enough that if you harvest that entire plant and let it dry down, it will produce some, if not much, viable seed. So this is a way to maximize the seed harvest in one swoop, quite literally. So in that case, you could lay a tarp out, and if you have a string of really dry weather, which is ideal but also feels fleeting at times these days, you can cut all those plants and lay them down on the tarp. The stuff that's really mature is going to fall right onto the tarp. The stuff that's not is going to have a couple days to dry. And if you can leave it outside for a period of days without predation or weather interfering, great, do that. Give them another step, a couple shakes, you'll get as much seed as you possibly can. Another alternative is to cut them, and if there's not too much seed falling off, you can gently slip them into contractor bags or lawn and leaf bags. And just because they're in a paper bag, put them somewhere cool, dry. They'll still be able to respirate, as long as there's not too many stuffed in one, and all the mature seed will fall in there. The caveat with this way is that you get a lot of chaff. And lettuce can be notoriously challenging to clean, because if you're separating by weight, let's say with a box fan, the little pieces of bract, seed, and some stems often weigh the same as a light lettuce seed does. And so if you're separating with a fan by weight, you're getting all that stuff, and you'll have to pick it out individually. A way around that is to use, there are particular screens that people make, but I think you can find the mesh at hardware stores. There are certain kinds of screen mesh that are not actually small squared screens. They are little individual slats. And you can sometimes find these on colanders too, if you find some of the old metal colanders. Instead of being little circles, they're actually just diagonal lines. And those are excellent for flat seeds like lettuce, because as you're shaking, that flat seed is able to slip through that slot, but the larger seed bracts and pieces of chaff will not. So if you can find yourself one of those and you're serious about saving lettuce on a commercial scale, then that's an excellent investment, one-time investment to get, is any kind of flat, slatted screen, whether it be a colander or a piece of a square of metal from a hardware store. So this is reviewing a little bit of what we said here. If it's hand harvested, you can rub between your hands, light agitation. You can also stomp whack on a tarp if you're holding the whole plant out, shake it in the bag, whatever. Less chaff, the better. Yes, snap test down here, easy enough, just like we talked about before. Instead of having to shatter it, you can just take a little lettuce seed, break it open. If it splits in half, you're good to go. So we're going to move on now to the chicory family, which is one of my favorites in the world. It's one of the more challenging ones to save for seed, depending on which species you're dealing with. But there are two main species we're talking about, which is Chicorium endivia, which we're going to talk about first, and Chicorium intybus. Chicorium endivia is endive and escarole. That is the endivia family. It is not Belgian endive. Belgian endive, even though it's called an endive, is not a true endive. It is Chicorium intybus. So if you're trying to save those based on the parameters we're giving you right now, you're going to be cursing Freed Seed Federation and seed school for the rest of your days. Because even though with both these species, as we'll see, They look very similar to one another, not in the actual foliage, but in terms of what the chicory flower looks like when it's in flower, what the seeds look like when they're dried down, how we handle them post-harvest, etc. They are radically different when it comes to their habits as a plant. So Chicorium endivia, endive and escarole, these are annuals. So follow the same rules as lettuce. You want to start growing them as early as possible. This is challenging for a lot of us who are market growers especially because endive and escarole, and this also includes Fabaceae, which is a type of endive, they're at their peak in late fall when it's cool and the weather is sweetening them a little bit. So it can be challenging to say, I'm going to save seed from these, especially if you're trying to select for flavor. But again, same parameters as lettuce. You're selecting for bolt tolerance, which we all need more of in any of the chicories that we're growing. So it's a service to start in the spring, even if your farmer intuition is telling you not to grow them in the spring because of past experiences. Seed type, being an aster, is also a dry seed. Chicorium endivia is self-compatible and is a perfect flower, and it's also a self-pollinator. So you can treat this one just like with lettuce. If you have one plant, it's not optimal, but it's entirely possible to save seed from that endive or that escarole plant, which is a really nice attribute because let's say you are growing a spring crop of Fabaceae, and all that Fabaceae bolts, but hey, there's that one Fabaceae plant that's taking its time, and it's big, and it's beautiful, and it's slow. You can dig that up, move it somewhere else, and you can get viable seed from that one plant. So endive and escarole are really fabulous, just like with lettuce, because you can make that real-time judgment of one plant or several plants that are doing something really interesting and different, and you can save seed from that and get viable seed. Isolation distance, just like with lettuce, 10 to 20 feet. One for viable seed, 25 plus for long-term maintenance. I should also qualify that genetic maintenance can also vary based on variety. So let's say you have an escarole population that's very, very uniform. That's generally indicating to you that there's less inherent genetic diversity because it's all doing the same thing all at once than an escarole population that's all more or less doing the same thing, but there's variations on size, on heading density, on when they're bolting. So when you have more observable diversity in a population, you can generally count on getting really good seed from a smaller population of plants because there's already more inherent genetic diversity. All we're trying to do is avoid a bottleneck where we've gone so inbred, even with something like a self-pollinator that is resilient enough to withstand small populations multiplying itself. We're trying to just avoid this genetic bottleneck where there's the point of no return, and now the plant's doing nothing that you want it to do, and you have to imbue some new genetics in there to kind of start over and get the selection for what you want. So with both Chicorium species, ripening is vastly indeterminate, even more so than lettuce. So the chicories have, as we'll see a picture of, I think soon, these seed bracts that follow the beautiful kind of purplish blue flower that we know so well from roadside chicories. These bracts, once they're fully mature, will break open readily. But until they're fully mature, and especially if you're pulling whole plants or cutting branches, those seed bracts will hold like super glue, and they become much more challenging to break open. So decide for yourself, again, how much seed do you want? What are your breeding priorities or your selection priorities? If you can go in there when the pods on there are super, super brown and just about to break open, and you can pick those off individually, you'll feel those bracts give way, and you'll have seed basically in your hands. That will be happening from August into almost October, depending on the variety. So this is a very long window of harvesting. If you want to get the best bang for your buck, or if you have, let's say, finches or other birds who absolutely adore chicory seed, and you have an emergency situation where you need to cut everything, which happens more often than you think. In fact, the more you save seed, the more the birds will visit you, for better or worse. You're going to want to cut branches or pull whole plants. And that's when we use the 2/3 maturity rule. There's enough there that the most mature pods may break open, but probably won't. The immature pods won't produce viable seed, and somewhere in between you will get these bracts, again, that will mature to a brown, that will have viable seed in them, but you really have to coerce them to get them open. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. So like we said, you can rub these seed bracts, these seed pods, between your hands when they're super ripe, and those hand-picked pods will just break right open, and then it's relatively easy to clean from there. If you're harvesting branches or whole plants, you need to pound the hell out of them. So some people on a small scale have had good success with using a rolling pin. I've never done that before. But any kind of hard, round, cylindrical object that you can roll back and forth, you're just crushing those bracts. And the chicory seed is small and flat. So unlike the beans or the peas, this is not something you have to worry really about damaging the seed at all. In fact, we took cues from one of our breeder seed grower friends in the Pacific Northwest when we started growing chicory on a commercial level by investing in a really inexpensive electric chipper shredder. And so we're taking entire stalks and we're ripping this thing through a chipper shredder, and the chicory seeds are completely unharmed at the end. It's a lot more cleanup work to do. But basically, when you have these really secure bracts, you want to just thwack the heck out of them to get them to break open. And sometimes just whacking them or stepping on them might not get every last one. It may require some heavier applications of things. Slatted screen works again great for cleaning these up. Separating usually with a fan also works great. Keeping in mind that sometimes when you're using a box fan, you're not just trying to blow the chaff away. Sometimes with something like a chicory, you may have pieces of seed bract or stem that actually weigh more than the chicory itself. So think about this as you're setting it up. If you have a box fan set up and that's how you're winnowing things, you can actually set up two different buckets. One is the bucket where the heaviest stuff, as you're dropping down your seed and letting it fall with all its chaff, the heavier stuff is falling into the first bucket instead of the seed, and the lighter seed is actually falling into a bucket further away. So just because you're cleaning the seed doesn't mean the seed has to be the thing to fall. Meaning, if you're just keeping a wide berth for what you're dropping in there, you may be dropping seed and pieces of chaff that are as heavy as the seed. You got a lot more to clean later, and you're doing the same thing over and over again. So just think about ways that you can separate it by actually blowing the seed a little further and letting some of that heavier stuff fall to the ground. Straightforward enough. Snap test for storage, and that's it. You're done. Now we're going to talk about endive and escarole's specific cousin, Chicorium intybus. This is a great introduction to biennials, which many of you remember from last week or previous classes, or just general botanical knowledge. A biennial, so we're all on the same page, is something that spends 2 seasons to produce seed. The first season, it is accumulating vegetal growth, and it's storing up all that energy in its root, in its bulb, in its stem, to go dormant and wake up with a new energy to produce seed. So, as we'll talk about in a second, there are vernalization requirements with biennials that are important to consider if this is something that you are saving seed from, and we'll run through that in a second. Same as Chicorium and endivia, dry seed. The flowers are perfect flowers, meaning they have the parts, the pollen and the ovary within them, but they are more often than not self-incompatible. You find this with all outcrossers. Not all outcrossers, because there's no alls, but most outcrossers. Self-incompatibility is a mechanism to ensure that you're getting a diversity of pollen to keep that population nice and robust. So even though there's a little more legwork in saving something that's an outcrosser, it's just something to consider for larger populations, I guess is what I'm saying here. So the isolation distances here you can see grow considerably, depending on wood breaks, on the way the wind blows, on what your neighbors are growing. An isolation distance here can be as close as 800 feet or as far as half a mile. A major consideration that you see down below is this beautiful flower that our bumble friend is spending her entire day on pollinating. These are cross-compatible with the same flower in the wild, with roadside chicories. Chicorium intybus. Chicorium endivia is also compatible with Chicorium intybus, but you rarely see that because Chicorium endivia has such a tendency towards self-pollinating that it almost always is fertilizing itself before outcrossing happens. But it is possible. It's just much less possible with Chicorium endivia. So if you grow these side by side, there is a chance that some crossing can occur. Something to keep in mind. But that would almost always be the Chicorium endivia seed pollen coming into the Chicorium intybus, because basically they're much more ripe for the reception when a bumblebee gets there. They haven't beat the bumblebee to the punch. For viable seed with any Chicorium intybus and many outcrossers, 5 plants will give you viable seed, but you really, really, really want to grow more. This is like great-grandma gave you an heirloom chicory, if she did, God bless her, or you're pulling something out of a gene bank, or you have something very rare that you're like, I got one chance with these 5 seeds. Can I get viable seed from these 5 seeds to multiply? The answer is yes. If you do that for one season, it's not the end of the world. You still have enough diversity in most cases that you can continue that on without much complications, especially with something like chicories, where compared to tomatoes or a lot of species of squash, that there's been so much breeding work done. Chicories comparable still have a lot of wildness in them. So they're one that if you're going to break some rules, it's not always great, but it's generally better to break the rules when it comes to something that has a lot more inherent diversity like a chicory compared to other outcrossers like brassica species that we'll talk about another day. So for genetic maintenance, we have here at least 100 plants. Heeding our own experience and those of our great mentor, Dr. Navazio, if you have the space for them, pushing that number up to like 180 or 200 plants is ideal. Now, just because you don't have space for 200 chicory-seeded plants in your garden does not mean that you should be discouraged if you're passionate about growing chicory. The best thing you can do is find some people to team up, because if you're saving seed from 20 plants here and somebody else is from 20 plants there and so on and so forth, if you're combining all your seed at the end of the year, you're re-imbuing diversity just by that act of combining. So just because you have a small plot does not mean you can't do this. It really means teaming up with other people and making sure that there's enough diversity in that seed population that the next year it grows, there's enough to draw upon. Makes sense? We use this example frequently, and I'll refer to it again when we do corn, but a famous example of this is master seed saver Will Bonsall up in Maine tells stories about a flint corn population that his community around Industry, Maine has been saving for generations. Most people have a postage stamp sized garden, but during the holiday season, everybody's visiting each other, and as they come to the host's house, there are two bowls. There's a bowl with the host's seed corn, and there's a bowl where you deposit your seed corn. So everybody would grow these postage stamp gardens of flint corn, which if you save seed from in 2 or 3 generations, you would have really sad corn. But because they were able to come and share seed during the holiday season and take some of everybody else's seed, they were recombining their seed stock every year and keeping the population vigorous. So it's a great example of ways that communities can get involved with saving seeds. So find a couple friends that are passionate about radicchio and get them to employ 20, 30 more plants and combine the seed, and you're good. So we're going to talk just a little bit here and in subsequent ones about vernalization. Vernalization can differ depending on the crop, depending on the species, sometimes even depending on the variety. But we use a general rule of thumb that if something stays 10 to 12 weeks at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder, without being, if it's frost sensitive, zapped by heavy freeze, then you're going to induce vernalization. Some things have very weak vernalization. I can give an example of certain species of, certain varieties of parsley that on a mild spring with some cold dips, you'll suddenly see bolting after 1 season instead of fulfilling its full nature. That's because that is a weak vernalizer. It's technically a biennial, but because the season is fluctuating, it needs a lot less time at a lot milder temperatures to convert its energy into flowering, and that's why you're seeing that. So this general 10 to 12 weeks, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or anything above freezing, essentially, between 32 and 40, will ensure that you have proper vernalization. And all that essentially doing is giving the plant its rest period so that it is triggered in its genetics and in its plant mind and spirit to wake up as a flowering plant. If you were to keep a chicory plant at 60 degrees in your house for months and months and months and months, you will not see it bolt. It needs a period of cold to convert that. It's not a day-length thing like we see with other populations. Different varieties of chicory, and then even within certain varieties, different strains of the same variety have different levels of cold tolerance. So Chicorium intybus, generally speaking, most seasons here in southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island in the zone 7B now, we can get away with overwintering chicories outside with little or no protection. If you put protection on them, as we found out before, that often can mean a wonderful invitation for mice and voles and rats to just creep under that warm, cozy spot and look at all this food. Isn't that wonderful? So that's something that you'll have to consider if you're overwintering things outside with cover on them, as we all are when we're carrying crops under row cover over winter. Certain strains and varieties are much cold hardier than others. That being said, Also, the size and state of maturity at which a plant goes into the cold season also affects its ability to overwinter. So if you're focusing specifically on seed production and you want to overwinter outdoors because you don't have a place to vernalize indoors, you don't have a big walk-in cooler or something like that, chicory plants and others as well, but chicories in this case really only need 6 to 8 sets of true leaves to be botanically mature enough to produce seed. And the smaller that plant is coming into the winter, the cold hardier it is too. So if you've grown this big, beautiful radicchio head that's just sitting there like a cabbage waiting to be harvested, that's going to get zapped by a cold night much more easily than the same seed a couple weeks later planted in the garden and being in a much smaller form coming into the winter. So just a consideration if you are overwintering outside, that the smaller the plant is when it goes into it, the better time it'll have with the fluctuations outside. Harvesting, storage, same as we talked about with Chicorium and Divia. They look almost identical in most cases when you are growing them for seed, when you have dry stalks. So if you are growing both species, make sure you don't put the stalks too close to each other or clearly label them, because if they get mixed up, they are indiscernible from one another. And I should also mention here, which I didn't before, the species or the varieties that we see in Chicorium intybus include radicchio. They include most species of Italian dandelion. They include Belgian endive. They include puntarelle. They include other things just generally labeled as chicory, including chicory root. Am I missing anything? I think that's pretty much all of them. Yeah. If you order from a seed company, you will see the genus and species, and just make sure you know which one you're getting.